Good morning. My name is Bill Riley, and I've been honored by the family to be a part of this celebration of John's life, important to all of us. Today we've really not wanted. Today we've needed for some time. And it's really important that we all share in this day together. For reasons I'm sure everyone understands, when the decision was made to involve this as a virtual celebration for most of the people out there, there were several concerns that developed, and one of those was that had the possibility of people watching on Zoom to not feel that connected or have an opportunity to express their thoughts to the family. We think we can help with that a bit, and Laura's going to share how to do that.
Sunshine on my shoulders makes me happy. Sunshine in my eyes can make me cry. Sunshine on the water looks so lovely. Sunshine almost always makes me high. And if I had a song that I could sing for you, I'd sing a song to make you feel this way. And if I had a wish that I could wish for you, I'd make a wish for sunshine on me. Sunshine on my shoulders makes me happy. Sunshine in my eyes can make me cry. Sunshine on the water looks so lovely. Sunshine almost always makes me high. If I had a tale that I could tell you, I'd tell a tale sure to make you smile. If I had a wish that I could wish for you, I'd make a wish for sunshine all the while. Sunshine on my shoulders. Sunshine almost all the time makes me happy.
On behalf of Joan and the family, I want to extend their appreciation for those of you joining us today, those of you, the speakers here in the room and the guests here, and all those of you out in Zoom, wherever you are. the participation of the speakers, as well as those of you out there on that Zoom network, give great testimony, I think, to the importance you all feel in recognizing John with today's celebration. We have an opportunity to focus on the many professional and personal ways that John influenced our lives. I hope you all have an order of the speakers today available to you. And I think you'll see their names, they'll introduce themselves, but you'll also note that they all represent organizations that in almost every case John was a part of, an influential part of, and was a real factor in the way those organizations operated over the past years. But probably more importantly, I hope you'll all note that in almost every case, they're here primarily because of their personal relationship with John and their history and their friendship, not as official representatives of that organization, even though they could do that. I think it's really important to recognize the depth and breadth of John's involvement as a person and as a leader across those organizations and the people he interacted with, and many of them are here today. I think that's important for all of us. And I hope the family will find satisfaction in remembering some of those relationships of John and his leadership experiences. For me personally, the past year has reminded me that a hole developed in my life, and it's a hole I didn't expect and didn't want. And I blame John for that, because he's the hole that appeared in my life. And maybe some of you share in that feeling, but today we have an opportunity to try to close that hole. I don't think we can do it. We're not going to forget John, but we don't want to miss John. I don't want to miss John. I don't want to deal with the fact that he's not going to show up with his bottle of wine and his unique label quite often to commemorate something that was important to me, to my family. And that was the kind of friend he was, that much of what he did was done with an eye and a feeling and a sense of what was important to other people. Our challenge today is to replace the pain of losing John with the joy of his memory. I think that's hard to do, but I think that's what John would wish for us. I'm continually struck by the number of people who, when you talk about John, will say, you know, he was either my best friend or among my best friends over the years. And so I don't know if he realized how many people felt that level of friendship with him. But I, of course, share that sentiment. Governor Bill Graves, who John worked with, could not be here, but he sent some thoughts, and one of those I want to share. So John was no BS, just operated on an even keel, the type that kept their heads when others were losing theirs. You know, and I thought about that, and I thought, you know, that's really significant, because I don't think I've known anyone that had such a consistent authenticity about who they were as John did. You know, if you knew John, you knew John. And I think we all knew the same John. That's remarkable, and it's important, and something we could certainly use today in society. As some of you know, my friendship with John started back over 50 years ago. The name tag I'm wearing was something John gave me at one of the very first environmental education workshops that I attended. Gary Hewlett was there providing the brains, John was providing the energy, and I was serving coffee most of the time. But that friendship evolved to the point that in the last 15 or 20 years, John and I would have lunch together every 2 or 3 weeks. We had a lot of discussions in those lunches. We talked about a lot of things. We talked about some of you. I'm not going to share what that was, but there was a lot of insight to what went on. But mostly in recent years, John talked about his family. He was intensely proud of his grandchildren, and he should have been. But you know, we also talked about the kinds of things that tend to separate friends sometimes, that can create chasms in friendships. You know, things like religion and politics. But John, being who he was, mostly to his credit, we could do that without rancor. We could do that with disagreements, but occasional agreements. You know, we always agreed on one thing. Every time we met, And as we left, it became really clear and apparent to us that it should be clear to everyone that we were the two smartest guys in the world. I think the significance, though, of our discussions was the fact that John had that ability to have an intense discussion with someone and present his views and his ideas and his philosophies and his thoughts. At the same time, give equal credit to the other person's ideas and views. And so that's why he ended up in his discussions, in my experience, without the kind of animosity that often occurs in those kind of discussions. I think that was one of the reasons he so valued his time in the Kansas Dialogue. And he was always promoting, you should come to the Kansas Dialogue, right? It would do you a lot of good. John always seemed to make that bridge. I know of no one, and I've met a lot of people in my 80 years, who could be an advocate for such intense ideas and items that would tend to produce that antagonism. But consistently, the people he was discussing those items with respected John and admired him for his views and his thoughts. And in that process, he influenced them. He influenced all of us, I think, in times. And he certainly was my greatest influence in terms of talking about and thinking about conservation and environmental education. Two concepts that as a farm boy, I don't think I had any idea what they were until John started beating on me back in the 60s. I read a statement the other day in a book that it made me think of John. It's a book, it's titled The Ethics for the New Millennium. It's by the Dalai Lama. I'll explain to X to who that was later. And it goes, quote, I am convinced that human nature is basically gentle and not aggressive. Every one of us has a responsibility to act as if our thoughts and our words and our deeds matter, for they really do. Everyone's life has purpose and meaning. And I think John was the greatest symbol I've known of a life that had purpose and meaning. And I'll miss him, and I do miss him. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill, and good morning, Joan, Strickler family members, and guests. I'll take just a sidebar and tell you that I made 3 trips to the Kansas Forest Service over my years. That means I started in February of 1967. I went to the Army in November 1967, came back in November of 69, left for 30 years, went to the U.S. Forest Service in Washington, D.C., and then also came back here in 2008, retired in 2019. Long way of saying I've known John as a friend and mentor for over 50 years. And Bill, when you and John were talking about we here on the panel today, was that before or after the bottle of wine? So, and I'll start by reiterating that I've known John as a friend and mentor for over 50 years. First met John when he was on an employee recruiting trip to University of Missouri in the fall of 1966. A more significant meeting occurred to him in February of 1967 when I accepted a watershed forester position at Hiawatha. The job's first step was to report to Manhattan for employee orientation and the assignment of a state car. That was the first time I met Harold Gallagher, the state forester. Learned at that meeting that Harold trusted his employees and provided them the freedom to do their jobs under the rubric of use good judgment. Later learned that John had penned a document focused on good judgment, and all the staff at that time had labeled that document the Book of John. I don't remember a lot of details about the Book of John except 3 things. Number 1, and probably most importantly, a comment was, don't be afraid to say, I don't know when a question is posed to you. But go on to say, I will find out and I will get back to you, and do not short circuit those last 2 steps. One of the other things within the Book of John is we don't pay moving vehicle violations. And number 3, you know full well when all you foresters finish with a day in the woods, you're going to want a drink, but don't put the state car in front of the bar. You know. And incidentally, John was a friend and mentor from several other foresters and clerical staff. This was an especially challenging period in the 60s and 70s as the Department of State and Extension Forestry experienced a growth spurt through the watershed forestry, Corps of Engineers, community forestry, tree improvement, wildfire equipment, simulator-based wildfire suppression training, and containerized ceiling production. Big job of working with staff to find offices, vehicles, and support equipment for 13 new foresters, many temporary laborers at the Corps of Engineers sites, and a host of clerical staff to help lighten the state office load. Simultaneously, John was handling most of the paper details associated with the construction of the State Forestry Office, the wildfire equipment shop, the conservation trees, greenhouse, and head house. Additionally, he was an avid writer, including peer-reviewed documents, an avid marathon runner, and a dedicated ambassador for environmental education. Initially through the U.S. Forest Service Investigating Your Environment series, and later providing leadership for Kansas Association for Conservation and Environmental Education. Additionally, John and I were regular participants in the forestry's annual canoeing trek to Arkansas. We broke bread and sipped wine in many locations, to include Eugene, Oregon, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Washington, D.C., to name a few. We shared a few short duration, not marathon, running events at some of those locations. And the standard practice was to meet in the hotel lobbies at 6 a.m. for 2 and 3 mile runs. We teamed up on a few golf events. We both had golf sticks, but no one ever called us golfers. Shared correspondence over the years, with broken bones often being the primary subject about John. In recent times, John would often tell the assembled that he hired me twice. And actually, some people like Bill Riley would stand up and say, John, a little more boastful. It sounded almost like a regret. So then go on to say, I was the greenest forester he ever hired. Case in point was the time early in my career when I froze because a county agent unexpectedly opened a recorder and asked for an on-site interview. That aside, I was honored to work with others to name the Kansas Forest Service's conference room in John's honor, and other group of people to secure the Kansas Natural Resources Society's Conservation Champion of the Year award in 2018. Lastly, pursuant to John's many medical issues over the last several years, I was a frequent visitor to Manhattan's Rehabilitation Center, the Bramley's House. Most often found John cheerful, upbeat, and anxiously awaiting a discharge. Proud to note that one of my last visits was only a day or two before his death. In spite of that late connect, Joan's phone call on February 23, 2020 was disbelief. John, thank you very much for your guidance, counsel, and friendship.
I am Rex Buchanan, former director of the Kansas Geological Survey, and I want to start by thanking Joan and family and Bill for the opportunity to speak here today, because I know a lot of people have a lot to say about him, and I appreciate the chance to say a few things in front of all of you. When Bill called me about this, we talked a little bit about our friendship with John, and one of the things that we talked about, one of his characteristics was how non-judgmental John was. It didn't matter how badly I failed or what I did wrong, John was always supportive, and I've got a story about that. When I first met John, John somehow got the idea that I had gone to Kansas State. And it was hard for me to correct John, and so I didn't. And for the next couple of years, John would introduce me to people, and he would say that I went to K-State. Well, finally, after a while, I thought it was clear that John and I were going to be seeing each other regularly, and I thought, well, I got to fix this. So one night it was a Christmas party at Ramona Anschutz's house, and I pulled him aside and I said, John, I need to tell you, I didn't go to Kansas State. To John's credit, he handled that very well. He never held that against me. Probably also helped that I also didn't go to the University of Kansas. People have talked today about the wine that John gave people every year, and he gave me a bottle of wine every year with his own label on it. And usually in return, I would give him a book. And I thought this past year about what book I would have given him last Christmas. And the book I came up with was a book by Barry Lopez, and the title is Horizon. And in that book, Lopez talks about elders. And here's what he wrote. Their feelings toward all life around them are more tender. Their capacity for empathy greater. They're more accessible than other adults. Elders are looking neither for an audience or for confirmation. They know who they are, and the people around them know who they are. They do not need to tell you who they are. And that was John. And here's something else about John. He fostered community, as Bill already mentioned. Obviously, he was part of the community of forestry, and I got to know him through the community of environmental education in Casey. He was part of the Nature Conservancy community, the Cause community, Kansas Dialogue, and probably lots of other ones that I don't even know about. He melded people from these different but similar groups into a community that you, by your presence, either in person or online, are part of today. John and I had several conversations over the years about spirituality or religion or whatever you want to call it. A lot of those conversations, Bill, took place at Rock Springs. And John believed in what he called the Church of the Great Blue Dome, or the outside world. Now, John and I never talked much about the afterlife, so I'm not sure what he and the Church of the Great Blue Dome thought about it. But here's what I think. John lives on through this community, the one that's here today. And all of us were really lucky to be part of that. And as long as we work on behalf of environmental education, on behalf of plants and animals and water, as we display kindness and gentleness toward others, we will remain part of that community, and the community will continue. And that's just about the best legacy I can think of. So thanks again, Joan and Bill, and for all of you for listening and for the opportunity to say these things. John was the best, and we miss him, but the community he created goes on. Thank you.
Good morning. It's my honor and my privilege to have a few moments to share some thoughts with you, his family, and his friends as we celebrate John's amazing life. I first met John when I applied to be the assistant director with Casey 23 years ago. So I haven't known him as long as Bill and Larry, but I'm not as old as those two. So I was so fortunate to be offered the job. And as I reported for my first day of work with John, where he had somehow squeezed into his very cluttered office another desk and a computer for me, John told me that my first task was to get him organized, and I just about quit that day. But if you've never seen John's office, let me describe it to you. He had file holders, notepads, papers stacked in these huge piles on his desk and on the floor all around him. And then he had these two giant file cabinets that were full of files. And so I began the task of getting him organized. For those of you who've gotten one of John's bottles of wine and had that privilege, you've seen the way that he writes. Well, he had labeled every single one of his file folders that way, which was really beautiful, but sometimes super hard to read. So he'd done that. I might have undone it a little bit, but it was like doing an archaeological dig. The further I go into the pile of John, the further back in time I would go into the history of Casey's work and the projects. And I thought, actually, that turned out to be a really genius way for me to find out all about the organization. I told John, I teased him all the time that I wasn't sure how he ever found anything. But for those of you who've seen my desk, It seems John passed that trait down to me. And sometimes I look at those stacks on my desk and I think, John, I sure wish you hadn't taught me that little trick of yours. But I did, like all of you, learn so much from John. Because he was a forester, he used to think of things in the long term. You don't plant a tree and expect to see the fruits of your labors for years or even ever. And that's important in environmental education. You plant the seeds and you know that it could be some time before you see the results. So when I would get impatient and in a rush, John would slow me down. He taught me to look in the long term and to take steps today that will pay off down the road. And after he retired from Casey, which was his second retirement, by the way, he was still really involved with Casey because it was his baby. He was one of the founders of the organization back in 1969, and he was incredibly passionate about the role of education for the long-term good of this place we call home. And I would turn to him constantly for advice. And John was always ready to listen. He was so wise and he knew so many people. I thought, I'll never be able to do this without him. But he always believed and supported me in every possible way to make sure that I could. And I'm so grateful to John for introducing me to so many of his friends and colleagues and to this amazing conservation and environmental education community that Rex mentioned, and all of you who are joining us today are a part of. It's a joy for me to work with all of you and see all of you, and your passion, your commitment, your care, and your kindness. John started me down this path, and I'm so grateful for that. But John and I did not always see eye to eye on everything. I knew we weren't on the same page when he'd start off by saying, well, Laura, but we talk it through. And in the end, even if he still wasn't sure, he'd say, I trust you. And what a gift it was to have John's trust. He was such an amazing colleague and mentor. And I am so grateful to have gotten to know him in so many different ways. I hope I can continue to honor his legacy every day at Casey. Some of my favorite moments of John was when we would get to drive together to meetings. And John had this very gentle way of getting you to do what he wanted you to do without telling you to do it. So he would say things like, are you going to take 77 down to Wichita? Right as we were approaching that exit. And that was his way of saying, take 77. Or one time I was trying to find a place for us we were trying to find a place to grab some lunch, and I asked him where he'd like to go. And he said, oh, I don't care. There's a Wendy's just there down the street. Wendy's it is, John. And later on, I really enjoyed being his tech support. John would call me and ask me to go over to his house to figure something out. And that would mean a good hour of conversation about politics or religion, you name it, family, most often. We had the best conversations, and John truly knew the art of civic discourse. As folks before me have said, he was so stinking smart. And those conversations always helped me to look at things in a different way. Of course, one time when he asked me to come over for some tech help, when I'd finished that up for him, he said, hey, Laura, since you're here, do you think you could help me find my solitaire game? It's disappeared off my computer. It did make me wonder if he really needed my tech help or if that was just his cover to get me over. There's this quote I've always loved by Nelson Henderson, and I imagine John's influence gives this even more meaning for me. It goes like this. The true meaning of life is to plant trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit.
Could you repeat that?
Sorry. The true meaning of life is to plant trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit. John planted so many trees. I see them in his friends and colleagues, in his family, his children and his grandchildren. It's a legacy that will continue to grow, and I'm so honored to have been one of John's trees.
John was my friend and mentor for 47 years. And his footprints are all over state government and all over the statute books of Kansas.
In fact, one of the very first laws John wrote was to create the Advisory Council on Conservation and Environmental Education. And we introduced the bill in the House. It passed easily. But when it got over to the Senate, the president of the Senate was an old farmer, and he was very conservative, and he wasn't about to hear about environmental education. And so I had several discussions with him and didn't make much headway. So I said, John, you need to go make a call on the president of the Senate. And John did, and lo and behold, we got the bill passed. Then John wrote the Natural and Scientific Areas Act, which we also got passed through both the House and Senate, and it's in the statute books today. When I ran for governor, I tapped John to help me. And then in the governor's office, he served for 2 years. And he essentially wrote the law that created the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. We were skeptical that the legislature would pass it. So I signed an executive order creating it. And the executive orders are such that they take the force of law unless they're overturned by the legislature. So then I sent John to work to make sure the legislature didn't overturn it. And of course they didn't. And today it's codified, and it is the basis for which Wildlife and Parks operates today. John helped 2 governors find secretaries for the Department of Wildlife and Parks. He first helped me. We had a nationwide search, and John whittled it down to 2 people. So he said, these are the 2 guys I want you to interview. So I interviewed him, and he said, well, what'd you think? And I said, they're both real good. He said, well, why don't we hire them both? And we did. And we did. And then he came along 8 years later and did the same work for Governor Graves, and they hired Steve Williams as a result of that search. And Steve's here today helping us commemorate John's memory. So John not only left a legacy among his friends, but he left legacies that are ongoing, that are in the statute books and will be for the foreseeable future. One final story I'd tell about John, and it shows the true forester in him. In 1986, when I was running for governor, I made the decision to visit all 105 counties. And I had a political advisor who said, listen, I've got an idea. Said, you know, Dutch elm disease has virtually eliminated all of the American elms in the state. And every town used to have American elm trees on their main street and in their city parks. And there's a new variety of American elm been put out that supposedly is resistant to Dutch elm disease. And why don't we get 105 of those? And every time you go to a county, why don't you plant one of those American elms? I said, that's a fabulous idea. Let's get the trees. I told John about it. He said, wait a minute, we can't do that. I said, well, why not, John? Why not? He said, well, those trees have only been developed 15 years ago. He said, we don't really know if they're resistant to Dutch elm disease or not. We didn't plant the trees. We didn't plant the trees. So that's John, you know. He was a forester at heart. He was a politician under the radar, but he was a great friend and mentor. And the beauty of it is that his legacy will live on, not just through us, but through the statute books and the laws for many years to come. he truly was an environmental and conservation leader for which we're all totally indebted. Thank you.
I'm Gary Hewlett from Fort Hays State, and like many of you, it's a real privilege and an honor to be here. And I want to thank Joan, John, Carol, although I didn't recognize Carol because she had pink hair the last time I saw her, to help celebrate the life of John Strickler. As is the case with many of you, I've known John for 50 years. He and I are the same age. So I've known him a long time and had a lot of interactions with him, worked closely with him on environmental education in the state of Kansas. I first met John at the first Investigating Your Environment workshop at Rock Springs. Bill Riley and I were talking about that. It's hard to believe it's been so long ago, 50 years ago, Bill. That was the beginning of a remarkable friendship with John, and one that influenced my life in so many ways. I think some of you might have been at that first workshop, at least I know a couple were. John was a superb facilitator of environmental education, and that's recognized by the evidence, by the many accolades that he's received for his environmental education efforts. Most of those workshops took place in the 1970s and 1980s. During that time, I had the opportunity to learn a lot from John about environmental education. And I also worked with people like Bill Riley, Rex Buchanan, Tuffy Kellogg, for some of you remember Tuffy Kellogg from Topeka, Connie Elpers from Wichita. They're all gone, they're gone now. But those were great days of workshops. And John and I probably did 10 or 15 of those workshops across the state. And it influenced my life. And it influenced my role as a teacher in environmental education. It was during that time that John and I developed a real close friendship, and that continued and grew in the late 1980s. When John and I both worked in Topeka for Governor Hayden. I was serving as Undersecretary for Health and Environment. John was a Special Assistant for Natural Resources and the Environment. And during that time, we worked together on many environmental issues. One that the governor did not mention, the Kansas funding of the Kansas Water Plan, which was a very contentious thing, as the governor would remember. And other environmental initiatives that were put forward by actually the most environmentally conscious governor the state of Kansas has ever had, Mike Hayden. And John recognized that in Mike Hayden, we had somebody that was going to push for environmental education and for protection of natural resources. When John left the governor's office after 2 years, to come back to K-State and Kansas Forestry, I moved to the governor's office in his stead, but I couldn't fill his shoes. Well, I'll say more about his shoes in a little bit, but I couldn't fill his shoes, but I relied on him for advice many times during that period after he had come back to K-State. I have many fond memories of my relationship with John. It's impossible to relate them all, but I would mention a few. Once when we were working in Topeka, we went to Washington, D.C. together for some kind of a meeting. I can't remember what it was. And the governor was going to be there. And John and I were standing in this meeting room waiting to greet the governor. And when the governor came in the doorway, I went over and I said, "Hi, Mike, good to see you." And we greeted each other. A little bit later, John took me aside and said in a very slow voice, "Gary, we usually address him as governor, not Mike. He put me in my place, and I remember that so well. Another favorite example of my memory of him actually involves wildlife and parks and the newly merged programs. You know, John was very involved in putting those two agencies together, Fish and Game and the parks. And I remember he was speaking to a group of the staff from those two agencies, parks on one side of the room, Fish and Game on the other side of the room, and talking about the merger of those two departments, that newly created department. Somebody in the audience said, well, John, Mr. Acting Secretary, when do you think the merger will be complete? And he paused for a long time, and then he said in a real slow voice, when the last of you retires. And they knew exactly what he was saying, because there was a little bit of tension there between those two agencies. John and I took several road trips together, including one to Big Bend National Park. And I remember, Rex, you mentioned about the Church of the Blue Dome thing. John told me that one time when we were lying in Big Bend National Park in the window, which some of you have probably been there. And I asked him, John, do you go to church? And he says, this is my church, the Blue Dome. So he really meant that. I also took him to Mexico and introduced him to barbecued goat, cabrito. And I remember him calling Joan from the motel when we got back into Texas. And I heard him say, we went to Mexico and had some barbecued goat. She must have said, how was it? Because he said, I don't think I'm going to order that again. We also went on a great caving trip down in Missouri, Arkansas, and Kentucky. A couple of spelunkers, old spelunkers. And we went to visit John's cave down in Missouri. And he told me, he said, you got to go through some private property to get to the cave. And we pulled into this setting that was like a movie the movie Deliverance. And I said to John, if I hear dueling banjos, I'm getting out of here. But we went over to the cave, crawled through it on our hands and knees. He loved that cave. He really loved it. Those were great adventures. We drank a lot of John's wine, had a lot of good times together. We also did a lot of running together. Bill mentioned the marathon stuff, or Larry mentioned. John could wear out shoes faster than anybody I ever knew. And I couldn't figure out why that was the case. I mean, he was a big guy. But then one day I saw him take off his shoes and socks, and I saw his toes. Now, some of you will remember that. He had the weirdest feet ever. It was just amazing. It was amazing. In closing, I want to say that I really miss John. You know, like I say, we're the same age. During one's lifetime, you have a lot of friends, and with social media, you always have friends, you know, on Facebook. But you only run into a few people who really influence your life. And for me, John was one of those. He was a great friend, and I loved him a lot. Joan, John, Carol, thanks for asking me to help remember John. I know he's waiting for us across that rainbow bridge. And when we get there, I know what he's going to say. Did you stop and smell the roses? That was his favorite expression. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. My name is Brad Loveless. I'm the current Secretary of Kansas Wildlife and Parks. I'm humbled to be here today with a couple of our best past secretaries that the agency's ever known. And I really do appreciate Joan and Bill giving me this chance to speak today. on behalf of John. I first met John in 1997. I had left Wolf Creek and came up to Topeka to work for Western Resources. I was at an environmental education event at the Kansas History Museum. And I remember the room. I remember how the chairs were set up. I remember where I was standing when John came up and talked to me. Two things about that conversation were easiest to remember. First, what we talked about. Environmental education, of course. He was passionate, he was fired up, and we talked about that and Casey. Second thing I remember is John. And that night when I got home, I remember talking to Mindy about how good-natured he was, how smart, how focused, how quick, how he smiled and how he laughed. You remember that bright, toothy smile? I loved seeing it in the pictures, and the way his eyes twinkled. We became friends through being on the board together at Casey, and then other environmental connections were added over the years. The Kansas Forest Service Advisory Council, Kansas Alliance for Wetland and Streams, Nature Conservancy and the work we were partnering with them on, and the Kansas Geological Survey field trips, which were terrific time together across Kansas. He always surprised me at the breadth and the depth of his knowledge and of his understanding of politics and people. John was a great judge of character. In fact, he warned me about most of the speakers that I'm up here with today. One thing that may surprise you, which I thought it would have surprised you, except almost every speaker has mentioned this, that John and I often talked about religion. But it's clear to me now, he talked with a lot of us about religion. John knew that I was raised in the church and I remained active. And John was interested in my experience in religion, but not in terms of the organization, but really in how it was manifested in people, in practices, and in politics. We both lamented at the harm and hate that was coming from people in the name of religion. We tried to separate the principles, the practices, and the politics and the key aspects of religion from what often were bad results. John knew that the understanding he was seeking was a lifelong pursuit of mine. And I was glad to share what I knew and more often what I didn't know with him. I told John about the story of a Sunday school teacher I had in the 5th grade named Velma Thorpe in Kettering, Ohio. Velma was a tiny woman with a spray of white hair. She was long retired from the public school system that she taught in. And I don't know exactly how old she was, but I was guessing back then she was about 150. We were a lively bunch of kids. And I still treasure an old picture of us and Velma from those Sunday school days. Velma taught us and she listened very patiently. I don't remember specific lessons that she passed on to us, but I can't forget the warmth, the joy, and the love that she shared. As I grew up, Velma, I would see Velma every Sunday at church. She always made a point of finding me and asking me questions. She wanted to know about school, about sports, about my plans, even about girls. She wanted to know all that. She was interested in everything. She cared for me and about me without exception. So in my early 20s, at Christmas time, I was back home in Ohio from graduate school at KU. And I was at church and they were serving communion. And for some reason, I was sitting up in front of the congregation because I never sat up there, but I was sitting up there then. And people were taking turns coming up to the communion rail. And Velma, who's now approaching 175, was also approaching the communion rail, very small, deliberate steps. And just when she was almost to the rail, her shoe caught on the carpet and she fell. And she didn't fall like a sack of potatoes that you were dropping. She fell like a slip of tissue paper that was kind of sliding from a table down to the floor. But in the process, she hit her head on the communion rail and she went down flat and she was still. Now, the reason why I told John about Velma is because she lived out what I thought was central to Christianity as I understood it. And that message is love. And it's not just any kind of love. It's a kind called agape love. And it's a specific love that strives for the very best for others, the very best, while seeking nothing in return. That's what I shared with John, and that's what I was striving for. And I'm sharing with you all this today, not because of the value of that central truth, but because of the way I experienced that special kind of agape love in John Strickler. It's been true since I first met John, whether I called him or he called me. He was always concerned about how I was doing. He'd ask 1,000 questions about family, the challenges at work, about relationships. He asked about details that most folks didn't have the time for or the interest in. He shared his history, wonderful knowledge of that, insights, and he had this valuable, great advice. In fact, it was sage advice. And John paid wonderful compliments. There were times over the years when John was very generous in his praise of something that I'd done. And those times had a great influence on me. And those have stayed with me until today. They shaped how I feel about myself and what I believe I'm capable of. It was just like the way I used to feel with Velma Thorpe. Oh yeah, back to Velma. So Velma's laying on the sanctuary carpet right next to the communion rail. And since I was sitting up front, I was first to her. So I went up and I knelt over, I gently rolled her over, and she had a cut on her head where she was bleeding. Not too badly, but her eyes were closed. And I held her hand and I felt her pulse and she was warm. And in about 10 seconds, she finally opened her eyes and she opened them wide. Velma was a small woman, but she had big eyes and she opened them bright and wide. She's looking up. And by that time, people had gathered all around us up there. And she looked at me and she slowly went around this circle with her eyes. And the hand that I wasn't holding, she picked up and she pointed at me. And she said softly, "He is one of mine." Now I'm telling you about Velma Thorpe today because I really want you to know about agape love. And I'm telling you about agape love today because I really want you to know about what John Strickler embodied so well for me in my life. With John, he always made me feel like I was his. And I bet John made you feel that way too. And I can give no greater thanks or higher praise than that.
Somehow, I never envisioned myself speaking at John Strickler's celebration of life. Why is that? We don't think about time going by like that, but it does. I'm Rob Manus. I'm the director of the Nature Conservancy in Kansas. My first recollection of John was at a KC workshop. That's where a lot of you met him. I was in charge of outdoor education programs for the Department of Wildlife and Parks, Kansas Fish and Game at that point. That's how old I am. And that's my first recollection of him. But John explained to me that he and I probably met in the 1960s when I was very small. He was working in the White Mountains of Arizona near in the Sholo area. And my dad was a wildlife biologist there. They knew each other then. John said, "I probably met you then." So good or bad, John has a fair amount to blame for me. And I want to pick up where Brad left off. The concept of feeling like you're one of his. And John was so proud of his kids and his grandkids and his family. And but I was proud because I kind of felt like I was part of John's family. Another thing Brad said that resounded is he really made me think about what I was capable of. And he made me believe I was capable of a heck of a lot. I'm going to tell just a quick story about John. And it's about him being a gentleman and a gentle man. He was a gentle man. But he was a man. He was strong. He was smart, super courageous. Super courageous, John was. He took on the most ridiculous fights sometimes. They looked like losses to me, but he'd take them on. What a courageous man. He was also gentle. And I saw both in this salient point. I was sitting in my office right after Bill Graves had been elected governor. And I was sitting in my office in Pratt at the Kansas Fish and Game, soon to become Department of Wildlife and Parks, or was the Department of Wildlife and Parks headquarters, field headquarters. And I'm minding my own dadgum business. I mean, it's really kind of a nice job as a special assistant job too. And so it was special projects. Didn't have to worry about anything for very long. You just did what you were assigned and you were done and you moved on. Great job. And John walks in my office. Rob. Well, hi, John, come on in. And we made small talk for a little while. He asked me about a bottle of wine he'd given me. And I've been advised to put my filter on because John had an honorary sense of humor. And anybody who wants to know that story later about the bottle of wine and its results, why, I'll tell you offline. He asked me about the bottle of wine. And he finally got around to the point. And any of you who've spent a lot of time with John, especially driving down the road in a car, know that sometimes John was very strategic about how long it took to get to a point. He didn't rush. He wasn't a fool that rushed in ever. Rob, he said, I'd like for you to think about being the acting assistant secretary of the department. And I said, well, John, I haven't been in this job very long. And we talked back and forth about pros and cons and what he'd asked me to do. And I finally said, you know, John, Keith Sexton, really sharp guy. He's been head of research for the department. He's got great political skills, great human skills. He's just a wonderful man. Keith Sexton would be a lot better candidate for this acting assistant secretary job. Rob, do you think that this would be good for your career? Well, I suppose it might, John, but I haven't been in this job very long. Well, I'll let the governor know that you're going to do this. He so gently led me down that path. And he made me believe I could do it. Not only that, he talked me into staying in the job as a permanent appointment also. So I don't know how that happened exactly. I don't remember that discussion. Steve Williams certainly was a part and party to that crime. But John forcefully, gently, like the gentleman he was, led me into that because he made me believe I could do it. Last thing I'll say about John has already been said. He was a friend and a mentor. He and I talked a ton about faith. Talked a lot about wine too. We talked about running. He actually ran. I just talked about it. A lot of road trips with him when he was on the board of directors of the Nature Conservancy. One thing I want to say there under the heading of mentor, it was just about 4 days ago when I was sitting at my desk in my spare bedroom, like we all have now. And I was thinking about an opportunity the Nature Conservancy has to get in more into agriculture and working more with farmers. And it seems like a really risky, new, bold, courageous proposition. And I sat there and literally thought, man, I wonder what John would say about this. What would John Strickler mentor me about in this moment about this thing? And I'm pretty sure John would have simply said, you know what to do. Do it. Thanks.
Well, hello. I'm Steve Williams. Currently, I'm the president of the Wildlife Management Institute, and formerly the Kansas Secretary of Wildlife and Parks. I first came to Kansas in 1995. Before that, I worked in Massachusetts and in Pennsylvania, which I think we all know is also known as Penn's Woods. So as someone that was born and brought up in the forested Northeast, it was quite a change to move to the prairie state of Kansas. I remember looking out over the Flint Hills with a wildlife and parks biologist who asked me, he said, what's wrong with this land that you're looking at? I thought to myself, there's not enough trees, but I was smart enough not to say it. This guy was looking at a few red cedars out in the Flint Hills, and he said, there's too many trees here. And I thought, man, I'm not sure I'm in the right place at the right time. But fortunately, as fate would have it, I was greeted by a fellow admirer of forests, and of course, John Strickler. John proudly told me that Kansas State Forest Service was the 5th oldest state forest agency in the nation. I never knew that. That time, John was serving as acting Secretary of Wildlife and Parks under Governor Bill Graves. Like everyone else here, it was during our first few days together that I realized what a treasure John was to me, but more importantly, what a treasure he was to the environment of the great state of Kansas. John patiently and expertly explained to me the importance of Kansas natural resources, its forests, prairies, waters, fish and wildlife, the parks, the agricultural and ranching culture. He had the task of taking me around to introduce me to state senators and representatives, some of whom I'm sure wondered what this wet behind the ears kid from back east was going to do in Kansas. However, in deference to, and with an understanding of John's years of experience and his rock solid reputation, even they accepted me as John's understudy, and I could not have asked for a better tutor. He was a consummate conservationist. His impact on Kansas ranges from the management of forests and wildfires to the management of its wildlife and parks, to funding for the Kansas water plan, and for his lifelong love of environmental education. His dedication to the profession was unmatched. He was always learning, always teaching, always giving back to others. His influence was not contained to Kansas, though. He served on national organizations and was very proud of his relationships with the National Association of State Foresters. He was the kind of guy that both received awards for his work. He also had them named after him, the John K. Strickler Award for Environmental Education. John was good, we've heard this before, John was good at almost everything except retirement. When most retirees would be sitting on the porch watching the world go by, John continued his passion for natural resources with the Kansas chapter of the Nature Conservancy, the Kansas Association of Conservation and Environmental Education. He was a tireless champion for conservation all his life, from his time in Happy Jack, Arizona, to his final days here in Manhattan and his beloved Kansas State University. I spoke to two of John's friends this last week, Bill Graves and Joe De La Torre. They had fond memories of their time with John, and they both commented time and again in our conversation that John was a good guy and always willing to help in any issues that they faced. Bill Graves reminded me that John was instrumental in developing the natural landscaping at Cedar Crest, of course, the home to Kansas governors. John was the type of guy who counted governors, and senators, and representatives as personal friends, yet he never forgot his Missouri roots and upbringing. I also want to close with something that's a little more personal. John and I spent many hours together as he was trying to train me to be the secretary. A lot of those times were driving across the great expanse of Kansas. He talked and I learned. We laughed at each other's jokes and observations. And on one occasion, for whatever reason, John and I were talking about retirement. Again, something John wasn't very good at, and that's something I really had no business of thinking about at that point in time. For some reason, we were talking about the stock market, and John commented, he didn't really follow it that much. And in that slow Missouri drawl, he said, "Money bores me." That time that struck me as funny, but on further reflection, I think it tells you a lot about the heart and soul of John Strickler. Money may have bored John, but his love and passion for his family and the natural resources of Kansas interested him all his life. Later, I sent John a New Yorker magazine cartoon of an old, well-to-do gentleman wearing a tweed jacket and strolling through the woods with his young grandson. The well-to-do gentleman remarked to his grandson, "It's good to know about trees. Just remember, nobody ever made any big money knowing about trees." Now, I don't know anything about John's financial wealth, but I do know he was rich beyond measure when it comes to the love and respect of his many friends and the love and respect that his many friends and colleagues had for him. Well, my life, like so many others, all of us here, was indelibly enriched by my association with John Strickler. So I proudly celebrate his life with all of you who've had the great privilege to call him a friend.
I think I said we all knew the same John, right? Sitting there thinking about John, what tremendous testimony this was to see the people that just finished speaking to all of us, and who they are and what they've done and who they represent, and their great feeling for John. With this background of renewed awareness of how significantly John impacted all these organizations, not only in Kansas, but beyond in fields of conservation and environmental education, we wanted to share just briefly an overview of some of these awards and recognitions, certainly not all, but just enough to kind of remind us all of how organizations themselves recognize John's impact and leadership, and would ask you to join with us now. Now we ask Rob to close our celebration today. Thank you.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see the moon for me and for you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue, clouds of white, bright pleasant day, dark sacred night. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces. People walking by, I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? They're really saying, I love you. I hear babies cry, I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yeah, I think to myself, what a wonderful